is a kind of darkness that has nothing to do with the absence of light. It's the kind you carry inside yourself, that rides with you in the passenger seat, that breathes slowly as the asphalt disappears behind you, and the hours stop making sense. Marcus Thompson knew that darkness better than any person should. It had a name, a weight, a smell. And every time the moon began to swell in the sky, it also grew claws. Route 66 is not just a road for those who have traveled it alone in the middle of the night, with the tank nearly empty and the mind too full. It is almost an entity. It cuts through the broken heart of America, passing through towns that time forgot, through gas stations where the signs flicker like tired eyes, through motels that seem to exist outside the calendar, outside memory, outside any map anyone would bother to consult. Marcus had crossed that asphalt countless times, but that night, that specific night, with that specific moon setting the sky on fire like an open wound, he knew the trip would be different. His body was already warning him, his bones were warning him, every muscle beneath his skin seemed to be waiting for something he didn't have the courage to name. He had left Albuquerque hours earlier, with no clear destination, no planned luggage, only the desperate need to put distance between himself and the apartment where the walls knew too much. The radio played static between stations, and Marcus left it that way. White noise was better than silence, and silence was better than the thoughts. But the thoughts came anyway. They always came. They reminded him what he was, what he became, what he had done the last time the moon had looked like this, round and cruel as an eye that never blinks. There was blood he couldn't explain. There were gaps in memory that opened like holes in rotting pavement. And there was, beneath everything, the dark certainty that this night would be no different, unless he found a place to lock himself away before the sky completed its cycle, and something inside him completed its own. The sign appeared first as a rust-colored promise cut against the deep blue of the desert. Dusty Pines Motel. Dusty Pines. What an honest name for a place that had clearly given up on impressing anyone a long time ago. The light on the P of Pines was dead, and what remained blinked in an irregular rhythm, like the pulse of someone running a fever. Marcus turned into the gravel parking lot without consciously deciding to. His body chose for him. His body always chose these days. And that was precisely the problem. The car stopped between two equally tired vehicles, a pickup with a dented side panel and a sedan covered in faded stickers that looked like maps of a lifetime of one-way trips. Marcus sat behind the wheel for a long moment. Outside, the New Mexico desert stretched in every direction like a sentence with no punctuation. And the moon, the goddamn moon, was already high enough to throw sharp shadows on the cracked ground. He felt the heat first. Not the heat of the engine or the night air. It was the heat from inside, the kind that rose through the bones like heated metal, that made the skin tingle as though it were trying to shift out of itself. He walked into the motel office with measured steps, each movement calculated to appear normal. The night attendant was a middle-aged man with red eyes from someone working impossible shifts, and he didn't look at Marcus long enough to notice that something was wrong. The hands that trembled slightly as they reached for the key, the temples that visibly pulsed, the eyes that seemed to capture light in a way that ordinary human eyes simply do not. Marcus paid in cash. He always paid in cash, Leaving a trail was a luxury he couldn't afford. Room 7 was at the end of the exterior corridor, far from the ice machine that groaned every hour, far from the room where someone was watching television at way too high a volume. It was the most isolated room available, and Marcus had asked for it specifically. He locked the door, slid the chain, pushed the small wooden table up against the door as a makeshift barricade that he knew with a painful clarity, wouldn't be enough if things got worse. But it was what he had. It was always what he had. The walls were the color of old sand. The carpet was some indefinable shade of shadow. And the only picture on the wall showed a peaceful lake surrounded by trees. A scene of such absurd tranquility, given the circumstances, that Marcus almost laughed. Almost. There was a protocol. Marcus had developed it over years of trial, error, and consequences. He preferred not to remember. First, cold water. The shower on full cold as long as possible. The cold delayed the process, or at least that was what he believed, or what he needed to believe to keep functioning. On the days when the moon was small and the illusion of control felt almost real, he stood under the freezing stream so long that his fingers lost feeling, that his teeth chattered in an involuntary rhythm, that the skin at the tips turned bluish. And even then, even with all that cold, he felt the thing growing. That animal heat with no logical origin, that welled up from somewhere between his lungs and his spine, that did not obey outside temperatures, because it was not of this outside world. He stepped out of the shower and faced the fogged mirror for a moment before wiping it with his palm. What looked back at him was Marcus Thompson, still for now, 33 years old, dark hair, short, plastered to his forehead by the water. Eyes that in that moment were still only eyes, still contained only what a human being should contain. But there was something at the edge of those eyes, an amber glow, that pulsed like an ember when the bathroom light flickered for a second. Marcus stepped back from the mirror. The transformation process, he had read everything in existence on the subject, from folklore accounts to obscure internet forums, from digitized grimoires to anonymous testimonials from people describing exactly what he lived. Was not like in the movies. There were no bones cracking in slow motion, no dramatic scream echoing through the forest. It was more like drowning, like the feeling that another version of you begins pushing from the inside out, and you, the you who knows your name, who remembers the color of your mother's eyes, who understands what regret is, begins to shrink. The inner voice you recognize as your own grows more distant, like someone shouting from the other side of a rising river. Marcus knelt on the carpet, the color of doubt, and tried to breathe in the rhythm he had learned. 4 counts in, 6 counts out. Repeat until the panic receded enough to allow thought. The problem was the panic was not the real enemy. The real enemy was the other thing. The thing that didn't panic. The thing that didn't recede. The thing that waited with the terrible, irrational patience of a predator that already knows the prey has nowhere to go, because the prey was himself. Marcus closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were no longer entirely his. There is a theory, he had read it on some forum at 3 a.m. during one of his desperate periods of searching for answers, that the transformation state is not a replacement. It's not as if Marcus leaves and something else enters. It's as if two tenants are fighting over the same space, and the outcome is determined by which one has slept better, has eaten, has had more time to prepare. That night, the monster had rested. Marcus hadn't slept in 2 days. He was on his knees in the corner of the room, between the bed and the wall, the worst possible place to have a breakdown, but the best possible place to try to contain himself. The claws, because that is what his fingers had become, partially in that terrible progression that stopped at some indefinite point between human and something else, scratched the carpet without conscious intent, like the reflex of an overloaded nervous system. His breathing had changed in rhythm and depth. His chest rose and fell in a pattern that was not entirely human, slower between inhales, more abrupt on the exhales, like the breathing pattern of an animal on alert. And yet, and this was what made everything more frightening, not the monster itself, but this specific detail. Marcus could still think, not with the clarity he had during the day, not with the orderly language of someone who reads newspapers and gets jokes and remembers to pay bills. But there was a residual consciousness that observed what was happening with a kind of distant horror, like watching an accident from the other sidewalk. He knew he was in room 7 of the Dusty Pines Motel. He knew there were people in the surrounding rooms. He knew the door was locked. And he knew, with that part of himself that still functioned as a moral compass, that he needed to stay exactly where he was. The other part, the part that smelled the air and identified every living being within a radius, his mind couldn't calculate, but his instinct knew with precision. That part wanted something else. It pulled like a tidal current. It didn't argue, didn't negotiate, didn't ask. It simply pulled, with the relentless consistency of something that has existed far longer than any concept of ethics or responsibility that Marcus had learned in 33 years of life. He pressed his back against the wall, and his hand, the hand he still recognized as his own, with claws that shouldn't have been there but were, against his own chest. He felt his heart beating, too fast, too hard, but still beating, still there, still his. That heart had loved people, had been afraid of normal things, had in some life that seemed to belong to someone else, held hope. Hold on to that, some part of him thought, not in exact words, more like an intention than a sentence. Hold on to that as long as you can. When the light began, that first gray brightness that precedes dawn and that is not yet day but is no longer night, Marcus was in the same corner. That was all he knew with certainty. He was in the same corner, he was breathing, and the walls of room 7 were still intact. The table was still against the door. The carpet was scratched in several places, and there were marks on the walls at knee height that he couldn't look at for too long. The orange shirt lay in pieces across the floor like evidence of something that hadn't gone far enough to be called a conclusion. He didn't remember everything. He never remembered everything. There was a period, maybe 2 hours, maybe 4, time stopped working normally during the night, where memory simply didn't record, where the Marcus he recognized had receded far enough that there was no internal witness to what was happening. It was those gaps that frightened him most. Not what he knew he had done, but what he might have done without knowing. What might have happened in the space between the last clear memory and the first ray of morning light. He stood slowly. His muscles protested in a way he knew well. Not the pain of an intense workout, but something deeper, more organic, as though the body had been used for something that exceeded its intended design. Every joint was a reminder. Every step toward the window cost more than it should. Outside the Dusty Pines parking lot was quiet. The pickup with the dented side panel was still there. The sedan with the stickers, too. The broken sign still blinked in the irregular rhythm of an arrhythmic heart. Nothing was wrong from the point of view of someone arriving now without knowing what had happened that night. The desert stretched identical to itself, indifferent as always, with its low shrubs and its aged copper horizon. But Marcus looked at the parking lot floor and saw something that made his stomach turn. Tracks. Large, deep, in a pattern that was not human but also not from any animal in the region's normal inventory. They came from the area around room 7, described a wide arc around the perimeter of the motel, and disappeared in the direction of the open desert. He stood staring at them for a long time, calculating, trying to reconstruct what those tracks meant about where he had been and what he had done without the consciousness he called himself. The door to the room next door opened. The man who came out, early 40s, the face of someone who hadn't slept well, looking at his phone without paying attention to what was around him, walked down the corridor without looking at Marcus. He was alive. He was whole. And Marcus didn't know whether that was a result of his self-control or simply of a luck that wasn't guaranteed for the next full moon. He picked up his car keys, left without returning the room key. Route 66 waited for him outside, with its asphalt that asks no questions and its horizons that promise distance without ever really promising arrival. And as the engine turned over and the gravel of the parking lot sang beneath the tires, Marcus Thompson took one last look in the rear-view mirror. Not at the motel, not at the desert, but at his own eyes in the small fogged mirror. For 1 second, just 1 second, they glowed amber, and then the road swallowed him whole.